The Bonanno crime family did not weaken because it lacked power. It weakened because it could not agree on how to use it. Long before law enforcement delivered decisive blows, the family began consuming itself from the inside, turning authority into a contested idea rather than an accepted fact. Its decline was not sudden. It was cumulative, shaped by distrust, divided loyalties, and a tradition of internal conflict that never fully healed. For decades, the Bonanno family had carried a reputation different from the other New York families. It was insular, bound tightly by bloodlines, friendships, and shared history. This intimacy gave it resilience in its early years, but it also made disagreement personal. When disputes arose, they did not remain procedural. They became emotional, generational, and deeply rooted. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, this tendency toward internal fracture had become impossible to ignore. While other families refined systems of discipline and invisibility, the Bonannos struggled to maintain unity. Authority was questioned more openly. Allegiances shifted quietly. The family did not break apart in one moment. It began to pull in different directions at once. Leadership instability was the core problem. Unlike families that institutionalized succession, the Bonanno family relied heavily on personal loyalty. When leadership changed, it did not simply pass to the next man. It was renegotiated. That renegotiation bred resentment. The legacy of earlier turmoil lingered. The Bonanno family had already survived one of the most damaging internal conflicts in Mafia history during the 1960s, when prolonged warfare and defections brought unwanted attention. Although the family recovered structurally, the memory of division never disappeared. It taught members that leadership could be challenged and that unity was conditional. By the time the modern era of federal prosecution intensified, the Bonanno family entered it with unresolved fault lines. These cracks widened under pressure. Members disagreed not only about who should lead, but about how visible the family should be, how aggressively it should pursue rackets, and how much risk was acceptable. These disagreements did not explode immediately. They expressed themselves in hesitation. Orders were delayed. Disputes lingered unresolved. Authority became ambiguous. Ambiguity is fatal to criminal organizations because it invites interpretation. Interpretation invites conflict. The Bonanno family structure became increasingly fragmented. Crews operated with greater autonomy, sometimes bordering on independence. This autonomy reduced efficiency and increased competition within the family itself. Instead of presenting a unified front, the organization became a collection of loosely connected interests. Law enforcement did not cause this fragmentation, but it benefited from it. Surveillance exploited internal mistrust. Informants found opportunities where unity had once blocked them. The family's internal disputes created openings that external pressure alone could not have forced. Unlike families that responded to pressure by closing ranks, the Bonannos responded by turning inward. Accusations circulated quietly. Loyalty tests multiplied. Members watched each other more closely than they watched outsiders. This atmosphere eroded cooperation and weakened command. The family still possessed revenue streams, but revenue no longer translated into cohesion. Money moved unevenly. Disputes over distribution became more common. These disputes were not just about profit. They were about recognition and control. Each disagreement reinforced the sense that the family no longer spoke with one voice. By the early 1980s, the Bonanno crime family remained one of the 5 families in name and history, but it lacked the internal certainty that sustained long-term power. It was not collapsing. It was drifting. That drift would shape everything that followed. As the Bonanno crime family moved deeper into the 1980s, the absence of internal consensus became more damaging than any external threat. The family's problems were no longer isolated disputes but a persistent condition. Authority existed, but it was not universally accepted. Orders were issued, but they were interpreted rather than followed. This distinction mattered. It marked the shift from organization to negotiation. Leadership changes intensified this instability. Each transition reopened old arguments about legitimacy and direction. Instead of reinforcing continuity, succession became a stress test the family repeatedly failed. The expectation that authority would be contested became normalized. Once normalized, it could not be reversed easily. This environment empowered mid-level figures while weakening the center. Capos exercised increasing independence, often prioritizing their own crews over family-wide cohesion. Coordination suffered. Rackets overlapped. Conflicts arose not because resources were scarce, but because boundaries were unclear. The family's traditional reliance on personal relationships deepened the problem. Disputes were no longer abstract disagreements over policy. They involved friendships, kinship, and personal history. Resolution became difficult because compromise felt like betrayal. Each unresolved dispute left residue. Law enforcement pressure magnified these internal weaknesses. Surveillance and informants did not need to penetrate a united front. They encountered hesitation and contradiction. Members spoke more freely in moments of frustration, revealing divisions that investigators could exploit. The family's internal conflict became an evidentiary asset for prosecutors. Unlike organizations that reacted to pressure by simplifying communication, the Bonanno family reacted by arguing more. Meetings increased rather than decreased. Factions sought reassurance, validation, and alignment. These interactions created opportunities for observation. The family's internal noise drew attention. The Bonannos struggled to maintain consistent discipline. Enforcement of rules appeared selective. Punishments were delayed or avoided to prevent further division. This restraint, intended to preserve unity, instead signaled weakness. Without consequences, authority eroded further. Younger members absorbed these lessons quickly. They learned that loyalty was flexible and that advancement could be negotiated. This altered the family's culture. Long-term patience gave way to short-term positioning. Trust declined as ambition rose. The family's historical identity as a close-knit organization now worked against it. Emotional ties amplified conflict rather than containing it. Grievances lingered because they could not be resolved impersonally. Every dispute threatened to reopen old wounds. Externally, other families took notice. The Bonanno family's influence declined relative to its rivals. Negotiations that once included them as equals now treated them cautiously. Their internal unpredictability reduced their reliability. Reliability, in the underworld, is power. The family did not lose territory overnight. It lost confidence gradually. Confidence is difficult to measure but easy to detect. It appears in decisiveness, in consistent enforcement, in the absence of hesitation. By the mid-1980s, these qualities were increasingly absent. The Bonanno crime family remained operational, but it no longer set its own tempo. Events dictated behavior rather than the reverse. The family reacted instead of directing. This shift marked a point of no return. Once internal conflict becomes the dominant concern, external threats gain leverage automatically. The family's energy was consumed by managing itself. There was little left for expansion or defense. By the end of the decade, the Bonanno family was weakened not because it had been defeated, but because it could not agree on what victory would look like. Its decline did not announce itself. It revealed itself in hesitation. By the late 1980s, the Bonanno crime family existed in a state of chronic instability that no longer required a trigger to express itself. Conflict had become habitual. Members no longer asked whether disagreement would arise, only when and between whom. This normalization of internal tension was the family's most damaging transformation. Leadership attempted to project continuity, but authority no longer traveled cleanly through the organization. Orders stalled at intermediate levels. Capos filtered instructions through personal interest. What reached the street often bore little resemblance to what had been intended. This distortion weakened accountability and encouraged selective obedience. The family's internal divisions hardened into factions. These factions were rarely formal and never publicly acknowledged, but they shaped behavior. Alliances formed quietly. Information was shared unevenly. Trust became conditional. Each faction believed it was protecting the family by protecting itself. This fragmentation altered how the Bonannos interacted with the outside world. Negotiations with other families became cautious and limited. Agreements were harder to enforce because internal compliance could not be guaranteed. The Bonanno family's word no longer carried the same certainty. Uncertainty reduced influence. Law enforcement pressure intensified, but it did not need to escalate dramatically. The family's internal disorder created exposure naturally. Members spoke defensively, sometimes recklessly, in attempts to justify their positions. Frustration produced candor. Candor produced evidence. Informants emerged not only from fear, but from resentment. Internal conflict created grievances that could not be resolved within the organization. Cooperation with authorities became, for some, an alternative path to resolution. The family's lack of unity made this choice easier. Efforts to restore discipline often backfired. Attempts to assert control were interpreted as factional maneuvers. Enforcement actions, when taken, were scrutinized for motive rather than accepted as policy. This skepticism paralyzed leadership. Every decision risked deepening division. The Bonanno family's operational effectiveness declined steadily. Rackets remained, but coordination suffered. Opportunities were missed because consensus could not be reached. The family's structure, once a source of strength, became a mechanism for delay. Generational differences widened the gap. Older members remembered periods of relative unity and struggled to reimpose them. Younger members had known only fragmentation. Their expectations were shaped accordingly. They did not assume stability. They navigated instability. This generational shift ensured that internal conflict would persist. It was no longer an anomaly to be corrected, but a condition to be managed. The family adapted to dysfunction rather than resolving it. Externally, the Bonanno family's reputation changed. It was no longer viewed primarily as a threat or a partner, but as an unpredictable variable. This perception reduced its strategic value within the broader mafia structure. Influence faded without formal loss. By the early 1990s, the family's decline was evident in its diminished role. It was still present, still capable of generating revenue, but it no longer shaped outcomes beyond its immediate interests. Power had narrowed. The Bonanno crime family had not been dismantled by force. It had been eroded by disagreement. Internal conflict had drained the energy required to resist external pressure. The family had become its own limiting factor. This condition set the stage for the final phase of its decline. The final weakening of the Bonanno crime family did not arrive as a decisive blow. It arrived as exhaustion. Years of internal conflict had consumed the organization's ability to respond coherently to change. By the early 1990s, the family no longer needed pressure to destabilize it. Instability had become internalized. Leadership existed, but leadership no longer unified. Authority was exercised cautiously, often indirectly, in an effort to avoid provoking further division. This caution preserved short-term calm but deepened long-term decay. Without firm direction, the family drifted further from coordinated action. The Bonanno family's historical reliance on close relationships now functioned as a constraint. Disputes could not be resolved impersonally. Every decision carried personal implications. This made decisive action rare. Compromise replaced command. Compromise weakened structure. Law enforcement capitalized on this environment without needing extraordinary measures. Informants continued to emerge. Surveillance benefited from predictable disputes and repeated attempts at reconciliation. The family's internal turbulence created observable patterns. The Bonannos became increasingly isolated within the broader mafia landscape. Other families minimized interaction, wary of entanglement with an organization whose internal reliability was uncertain. Influence faded not because territory was seized, but because trust was withdrawn. The family continued to generate income, but income no longer translated into power. Distribution disputes persisted. Grievances accumulated. Each unresolved issue reinforced the sense that unity was temporary and conditional. By this stage, decline was self-sustaining. Internal conflict discouraged capable leadership. Ambitious figures either defected, withdrew, or focused narrowly on personal gain. Collective strategy became impossible. The Bonanno crime family did not vanish. It adapted to survival on a smaller scale, but it never regained the cohesion necessary for sustained influence. Its legacy became one of missed potential rather than dramatic collapse. Historians would later recognize the Bonanno family as a case study in how internal conflict can undermine even deeply rooted organizations. External pressure accelerated decline, but it did not cause it. The family weakened itself first. In contrast to families undone by wiretaps or leadership decapitation, the Bonanno family dissolved its own authority gradually. Its downfall was not recorded in transcripts or defined by trials alone. It was expressed in hesitation, fragmentation, and distrust. The family's story serves as a reminder that power depends as much on agreement as on force. Without internal consensus, strength dissipates quietly. The Bonanno crime family entered history not as the most powerful or the most violent, but as the family that could not resolve itself. Its decline was not dramatic, it was continuous. That continuity of conflict proved fatal, not because it drew attention, but because it consumed everything else.